Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Daniel Horan, and I'm professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology, and I have the distinct privilege of serving as the director of the Center for Spirituality here at St. Mary's College. I'm delighted to welcome you to this first installment of a new series here, sponsored by the Center for Spirituality, titled the Ex Libris Author Lecture Series, which features authors discussing their recent publications on topics related to the mission of the center. Founded in 1984 with the generous support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross, and we have some sisters joining us in person and virtually, the Center for Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. It is a hub for scholarly and public engagement, and here we draw on intellectual resources in the Catholic and Christian heritage, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. Before we proceed with our exciting event this afternoon, we wish to acknowledge that we are gathering on sacred land and to honor the Native peoples who have been the traditional custodians of this place for generations. We particularly recognize the Pogagon Band of Potawatomi and the Miami, who have cared for this land and its resources for many generations and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we recognize our Native sisters and brothers and their cultures within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that we will be discussing topics today that include mental health issues. We have made available information for those who are gathered in person, information about health resources both on and off campus, and those are available on handouts at the doors on the way out. For those who are interested in accessing mental health care and support, I also want to point out that in addition to those resources on the handouts at the doors, there are additional handouts that feature the dates, times, and themes of the remaining 2 lectures in the series. I'll say more about that at the end of our event. But now it's my privilege to welcome our speaker this afternoon. Dr. Jessica Coblentz is assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies and Theology here at St. Mary's College, where her teaching and research focus on Catholic systematic theology, feminist theologies, and mental health and theological perspective. She's also a current Quill Faculty Research Fellow here at St. Mary's. She is the author of Dust in the Blood, A Theology of Life with Depression, about which she is speaking today. And she's the co-editor of what I can assure you is an excellent forthcoming volume titled The Human in a Dehumanizing World, Re-examining Theological Anthropology and Its Implications, which is due out later this spring. I know it's good because I'm the other editor. In addition to her contributions to numerous academic journals and essay collections, her writing has been featured in popular venues such as the National Catholic Reporter, U.S. Catholic, America, and Give Us This Day, where she is a regular contributor. Before working as a theologian, Dr. Coblentz served for several years in Roman Catholic national and diocesan religious education, parish young adult ministry, and college campus ministry. She earned her PhD in systematic theology from Boston College. One last note before I welcome Dr. Coblentz to the podium is that our format is for a 1-hour-long program this afternoon, and it's going to be in 3 parts. First, Dr. Coblentz will offer a brief presentation about her work. Next, we'll engage in a conversation on the themes of her book. And finally, we will open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. And we invite those who are joining us virtually to post your questions and comments either in the Q&A button or in the chat itself. So please join me in offering a very warm St. Mary's welcome to Dr. Jessica Coblentz.
Thank you all for being here. For those of you who are with us online, it's an honor to be a part of this exciting new series and to have the opportunity to be in conversation with all of you. Most of us here are probably accustomed to hearing about issues like depression from psychologists and social workers and other mental health care workers. For this reason, I want to begin my remarks by sharing a bit about why I, as a Catholic theologian, wrote this book about depression. There are two major reasons. First, I have learned from my own experience of depression and from stories from countless others who have experienced this condition that depressive suffering frequently rouses distinctly theological questions about God and about God's relation to the world, questions that theologians are uniquely equipped to engage. We find one example of this in the memoir of womanist theologian Monica Coleman, who, reflecting on a recurrence of depression during graduate school, recounts its effects on her spirituality. I had gotten in the habit of turning to God, writes Coleman, but all of a sudden I couldn't. It's not that I didn't want to, I just couldn't. I didn't trust God to take care of me. I didn't trust God to hear me, and I didn't trust the church to understand. Looking back on this period in her life, Coleman concludes, "My silence with God was my way of asking, 'Where are you, God?'" Psychologist Martha Manning recalls a similar experience amid her depression, writing, "It's hard to reconcile my old concept of a merciful God with my recent experience of a hateful, spiteful God, or a totally indifferent God who plays 52 pickup with people's lives." Manning asks, "What did I do to deserve what I got? Will God keep me permanently on the shit list? Will I ever be forgiven?" These doubts mirror what Manning elsewhere identifies as the continual lament of her depression. "Why me?" she asked. "Why me?" The respective questions of Coleman and Manning, "Where are you, God?" and "Why me?" are the cries of many who struggle to make sense of depression within their Christian worldviews. These are theological questions, and as scholars trained in thinking with the scriptures, beliefs, and practices of the Christian faith, theologians should have something to offer sufferers as they grapple with these weighty intellectual questions. The second reason why I, as a theologian, have taken on this topic concerns Christianity's preferential option for the poor. This Christian imperative is premised on the conviction that God accompanies and champions the vulnerable and the oppressed above all others. God, in turn, calls God's people, the church, to do so as well. That depression renders sufferers vulnerable is evident from any earnest look at this mental health condition. Yet additionally, research shows that in this country, those who are socially marginalized and oppressed suffer disproportionately from depression. Women experience higher rates of depression than men. Racial minorities are more likely to experience extended and severely debilitating symptoms when they suffer from depression. Transgender youth are nearly 4 times more likely to experience depression than their cisgender peers. Meanwhile, cis lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer teens experience significantly more depressive symptoms and higher rates of suicidality than their heterosexual peers. If Christians care about women, about Black and brown lives, about queer lives, that is, if Christians care about the vulnerable and the oppressed who God loves the most, then Christians must attend to depression. This book is my attempt as a Christian theologian to be faithful to this divine imperative. So now let me turn to the book itself to offer a glimpse of how I go about trying to do this. Dust in the Blood unfolds in 2 parts. Part 1 examines popular ideas about depression in American society, and then continues the particular ways that American Christians often talk about this experience. In everyday talk about depression, it's common to hear people like you and me characterize it as a form of long and severe sadness. Yet the narratives of depression sufferers reveal something quite different. They tell us that living with depression is not just a series of bad days, which is an unfortunate but rather customary part of how everyone experiences the world from time to time. Rather, sufferers describe their depression as a kind of dislocation into another world. It is a harsh reality where their otherwise typical experiences of connection, meaning-making, and agency diminish or even dissipate altogether. This imagery of displacement into another world conveys that depression is far more encompassing than ordinary emotion. It is a radical shift in one's experience of life. What's more, depression is an unfamiliar and uncomfortable world, an alien and unearthly landscape. Depression is, to use the apt language of phenomenology, a decidedly unhome-like place. While characterizations of depression as mere sadness miss these distinctive and difficult features, alongside them are two kinds of messages that US Christians tend to espouse about mental illness, both of which also diverge from how many depression sufferers describe and understand their own condition. The first popular Christian message casts depression as a sin, or as the result of a sufferer's sinfulness. It sees depression as a symptom of one's lack of faith, for example, or as God's punishment for some other misbehavior. This moral diagnosis appeals to some Christians because it promises that repentance from sin can heal and stave off depression. But other Christians are put off by this explanation, which can seem to shame and stigmatize depression sufferers by placing the blame on them. The second common Christian message about depression frames it as a sacred gift, a special cross to bear, or a dark night of the soul that God bestows upon people to help them grow in faith. Some Christians find this to be a hopeful message that inspires them to persevere and search for meaning amid their mental pain. Yet to others, this sounds like a message of toxic positivity, one that dismisses the horrors and meaninglessness that constitute many experiences of depression. Altogether, we see in part one how ordinary talk about depression, both in secular and in religious terms, often leaves something to be desired. For those who seek a richer, more accurate portrait of depression than mere sadness, and for those who are left unsatisfied by prevailing Christian messages about this condition, how else might they describe and understand this condition? I offer some resources for addressing this question in part two. There, I argue that Christians need only listen to what depression sufferers have already been saying to discover some alternative ways of talking about depression from a Christian perspective. As I mentioned, sufferers regularly characterize their depression as an experience of dislocation into a strange and inhospitable world, a harsh landscape, a wilderness even. And that's something about which Christian theologians have a great deal to say. Christianity's sacred scriptures abound with stories of dislocation into unhome-like places. Indeed, so plentiful is this imagery in the scriptural canon that Walter Brueggemann characterizes the Bible as primarily concerned with the issue of being displaced and yearning for a place. He labels the Israelites a landless folk and God's homeless people because of the frequency with which they are unmoored from home and immersed in a harsh and unfamiliar place. These unfamiliar places are often called wildernesses, a term that has both literal and figurative uses in the scriptures. Literally, they were specific terrains in the ancient world compared to, say, valleys or gardens. These wilderness terrains were known to be difficult to domesticate in service of human flourishing. Because the literal wilderness was known for its inhospitality to human life, biblical authors frequently employed the wilderness as a symbolic image as well, a symbolic image for human experiences of precarity, struggle, and even fatality. Thus, even when the Bible depicts actual earthly turf, these places often simultaneously function in the text as symbols for something else as well. It's no surprise then that over the course of Christian history, religious teachers and writers read biblical stories of literal untamed lands as meaningful analogs for the human struggles of the present day. The writings of the medieval mystics contain correlations between the deserts of the scriptures and the figurative wildernesses that they experienced in their relation to God. Protestant reformer Martin Luther used the Babylonian exile as an extended metaphor for the captivity of the laity. John Bunyan's classic, The Pilgrim's Progress, combines scriptural allusions to present a journey through what one scholar called the wilderness of the religious and political turmoil of the English 17th century. I could go on. This long tradition of correlating biblical wildernesses to contemporary experience has not only helped Christians see the realities of their lives in the sacred scriptures, it has also afforded them insights about how God relates to the circumstances of their lives. Carrying forth this tradition, I suggest that Christians see depression as a contemporary wilderness experience. And in doing so, they can use the wilderness tales of the Bible to learn how God might relate to their condition. In the Hebrew Bible alone, variations in why the Israelites find themselves in difficult territory, how they experience these places, and how God responds to them provide a whole array of theological insights for interpreting depressive experience and addressing questions like, where are you, God, and why me? Dust in the Blood considers various biblical tales of dislocation into unfamiliar lands, from Abraham's sojourn to the Exodus to the Babylonian exile, to tease out their theological implications for contemporary experiences of depression. Along the way, I show that some of these stories lend themselves to existing Christian messages about depression because they justify suffering as a punishment from sin or as a sacred gift. However, other wilderness stories offer something different that can expand the Christian messages about depression that we have today. One that I've become particularly captivated by is the wilderness experience of Hagar in Genesis 21. Hagar was an enslaved woman in the house of Abraham and his wife, Sarah. After Hagar becomes pregnant with Abraham's child, she flees into the wilderness where she encounters God, who instructs her to return to the clan with her newborn son, Ishmael. When we meet Hagar again, she has returned to life with Abraham and Sarah, who now also has a son of her own, Isaac. When the sight of young Ishmael and Isaac together provokes Sarah to demand Hagar's expulsion, Abraham consults God and eventually complies with Sarah's wish. Hagar is displaced into the wilderness with her infant son, and having been given very little water, they soon find themselves in death-bound circumstances. From this wilderness, Hagar cries out to God, "Do not let me look on the death of this child. God then calls to Hagar and opens her eyes to a life-saving well of water. Hagar's story ends there in the wilderness as the text gives way to Ishmael's story. Based on the text itself, Hagar's subsequent lifetime in the wilderness cannot be justified as an inherent good, something worthwhile for the spiritual edification it promises. Nor can it be explained as a punishment for sin when there is no mention of anything about her sin. Furthermore, recognizing that her suffering results from the malice of Abraham and Sarah does not explain why God relates to Hagar's suffering as God does, permitting it and withholding rescue from this life in a harsh landscape. As far as we can tell, her displacement into the wilderness and the suffering she endures there is in itself nonsensical, meaningless. It's a theological mystery. This makes Hagar's wilderness experience different from Abraham's or the Exodus or the Babylonian exile, all of which disclose justifications for why God has allowed the Israelites to be displaced and suffer as they do. At the same time, Hagar's suffering clearly matters to God. In a previous wilderness experience, Hagar had named this God the God who sees, and then named her son Ishmael, meaning God hears. Although God does not reveal to Hagar a justification or purpose for her suffering, God does see and hear her in her suffering. God is present to Hagar's pain in ways that Christian depression sufferers identify as very significant. What's more, by opening up Hagar's eyes to this vital well of water, God reveals new possibilities for survival and even improved quality of life that Hagar herself could not perceive. Observing this, Dolores Williams cites the womanist adage that God makes a way out of no way. By revealing new possibilities for living in this death-bound place, God does indeed help Hagar chart an otherwise unforeseen path for her life. In view of this, we can see how bringing Hagar's story to bear on contemporary depressive suffering could affirm those whose depression resists standard Christian messages of justification and purpose, while at the same time inviting sufferers to consider whether their suffering might nevertheless matter to the benevolent God of the Christian faith, the God who is profoundly concerned with and attentive to the suffering and the distraught. Hagar's story also invites depression sufferers to hold out for the emergence of yet unforeseen possibilities of community and agency and meaning and hope, possibilities that depression sufferers so often long for but cannot perceive in the worst of their condition. In the final chapters of Dust in the Blood, I take up this interpretation of Hagar's story as the basis for Christian reflection on depression, arguing that it provides a trajectory for thinking about several important theological issues, including divine presence, salvation amid suffering, and practical matters, such as Christian discipleship alongside those who live with depression. My hope is that this book's extended reflection on depression as a wilderness experience will open new possibilities for life-giving conversation about depression in our communities. Conversations that will honor the difficult realities of this condition, as well as the theological questions and mysteries that so often accompany it. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you.
I think I speak on behalf of that applause that we just heard, and the virtual applause I know that was ringing through the internet, a sense of gratitude and appreciation for your sharing and your summary. To help get the conversation going, I actually want to begin perhaps with your dedication to the book, which follows from this passage you just relayed to us about Hagar's naming of God and the God who sees. And it reminds me of Exodus 3:14 to 17. I'm not going to put you on the spot to remember the Bible. This is a Catholic school after all. But it's the theophany where Moses is before the burning bush. And there God says to Moses, tell the people of Israel, I am worried about them. I'm concerned about them. I'm with them. So the question that comes to me immediately with this dedication, it's clearly had a significant impact on your own thinking. What has your work on theology of depression in this study, how has it shaped your understanding of God?
That's a big question. I should say, for those of you who haven't seen the dedication, that I dedicate the book to God, which might, for people who don't read a lot of theology books, that might sound pretty ordinary, but it actually felt like a really sort of special thing for me, and a very kind of personal and vulnerable but honest thing that I felt I needed to do, precisely because so much of writing this book was me wrestling with who I knew God to be, and with the ways that my own personal experience of depression, which I do talk about also at the start of the book, affected my understanding of who God was. In many ways, I feel like I'm continuing to grapple with that question. But, I talked in my presentation about some sort of common Christian messages about depression. These are Christian messages that I was talking about in relation to depression, but these are things that some of us may have also heard in relation to other life experiences, other forms of suffering. And they assume particular ideas about who God is, right? That God might be a punishing God who kind of gives people what they deserve. And if they are sinful, they will be punished in turn. Or, this message that God is sort of giving us our suffering for our own good. Some people would say, this is a sort of sadist God who teaches us through our pain, even if it's for our own good. A lot of people have problems with that. In some ways, neither of these images of God ever appealed to me, and perhaps my own theological education blessed me with a huge range of images of God. So I didn't only have those particular ones at hand throughout my adult life, and in particular when I faced my depression. But I found from my own experiences of depression that I didn't have an image of God that made sense for what I was going through. Kind of like the Martha Manning quote where she's like, am I being punished? That doesn't seem right. Is it like she's kind of, is God doesn't seem merciful because I'm going through this? What is it? And when I came out of my own experience of depression and started doing this research, I think part of what propelled me was a search for who God was. I was looking for an image of God that made sense in light of my experience, but was also resonant with my tradition, with my faith community. And it wasn't, I think, until I really sat with Hagar's story and kind of saw some of my own experiences in it, but also recognized the God that she names, that I realized this is a God who makes sense not only for my faith community, but for my experience and my community's experience. By community, I also mean, other depression sufferers who I've been learning from throughout this research.
I have lots and lots of questions, I'm sure everybody else does, but I want to stay on this topic of your theology for a minute. And pick up on something that is, I would say, implied in this work, but knowing other projects you're working on and other work you do that I know you're thinking about. So I'm going to toss you this question. Maybe it's a spoiler alert for our audience for what might come. But one of the key elements of Christianity is this radical claim that God reveals God's self to us in history, most fully, obviously, in the incarnation. But, in this book and in addressing, for instance, some of those, we'll say, less than helpful popular Christian images of God, one of the things you respond to is, some presumptions about depressive sufferers and others who struggle with all kinds of mental health issues. And so I guess my question is this: what is your sense about revelation, about how God reveals God's self in history and in human experience? Does God reveal God's self to humanity through depression suffering and other forms of mental illness, or is that something totally antithetical to God's revelation?
I do think God reveals God's self in history, not only in the past, like you're saying, in the incarnation or in, the historical events or stories at the very least that are recorded in the scriptures. I do think the Holy Spirit is at work still today, and that God is at work in people's lives in ways that reveal new insights, important insights about who God is. And because of that, I went into this project with the assumption that studying the experiences of depression sufferers could teach us something about God. Now, sometimes it is the experience of the absence of God that tells us something about who God is or how human beings relate to God. But that, to me, is also revealing, right? I think one of the things that sort of shaped my own exploration of depression as a revelatory experience was that, to the extent that I had heard other people sort of make claims about God in relation to depression, they were making claims about what depression revealed that didn't always line up with reality, right? I talked in my remarks about misunderstandings of depression. And what I found was, like, people who were looking to depression to make claims about God, to understand God, were often misreading the experience, even just misreading the human experience. And so it seemed important to me that I had to do the best that I could to get the human experience right if I had any chance of thinking with others about what God had to do with it.
I think one of the things, speaking of human experience, that is distinctive about this book and your work is the methodology. It's very inductive in the sense that you center the self-narration of depression sufferers. You spend a lot of time looking at and working through what people say about this experience. What can you say? What do you think is important for readers to know, and maybe for our colleagues in the academy, scholars who might look at something like, oh, these popular depression memoirs or something like, what kind of source for theology is this? How is this rigorous? I think it is. I'll just lay it out there. But how do you answer that? What do you think is important? What do you want people to take away in your centering in such a deliberate way depression sufferers' narratives as a source for theology?
Mm-hmm. I mean, to academic skeptics, I would say that experience has always shaped theology. People's historical context, their social locations have always shaped theology. Even in a very traditional sense, the practices of the church have always been a basis for the beliefs of the church. And theologians have always drawn on experience and practice. What hasn't happened for most of Christian history is the centering of experiences other than highly functional, highly educated white men. And so, I mean, I'm trained, as you mentioned in my bio, in feminist theology, and like other forms of liberation theology, the methods of feminists are inductive. They start with experience, practice, reality, in part as a corrective to this long history of only centering the lived experiences and perspectives of a certain type of Christian thinker. And so to me, I've learned from the feminist theological tradition, from other liberationist thinkers, that if you're going to write about some reality, you have to listen to the people who are living that reality. And you have to privilege their perspectives. And I knew I should say that while I am a person who has lived with depression, I can speak about it from my own lived experience. I knew that I have my own biases and my own privileges that shape my experiences of depression. And so I needed to listen to a lot of people's experiences of depression if I was going to say anything of relevance about it.
So I know in this book and in some of your other work, you address the classical spiritual metaphor of the Dark Knight. And I'm not talking about Batman. And it's often been used to describe or even spiritualize experiences that might otherwise classify as symptoms of clinical depression. Can you talk a bit about the benefits and the pitfalls of that kind of language within the church?
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you asked this because most often over the years when I have talked about my research in Catholic contexts, whether they're academic contexts or parishes, the most common thing I hear from people is, oh, depression, it's a dark night of the soul. Technically speaking, the dark night of the soul is a sort of mystical experience that was named by St. John of the Cross, a Carmelite theologian and mystic. And he describes the dark night of the soul and as well, the dark nights. There's the dark nights of the senses, the dark night of the soul. We could get very technical about it. The idea is, though, that at very advanced stages of contemplative prayer, some people experience the radical absence of God, and it affects their sense of self, their sense of God. It's very, very painful. But it's a sort of purgative experience. People have to move through that absence in order to advance in their intimacy with God. So while it's a difficult spiritual experience, in its larger context, it actually bears great fruit for the person who experiences it. So when people talk about depression as a dark night of the soul, I think what draws them to that comparison is the fact that depression, like this particular spiritual experience, is very difficult. And there's actually some great and really interesting scholarship on how some aspects of these experiences are similar. There's often a change in the sense of self that a person has that's similar across these experiences. But in comparing them, people often project certain theological assumptions onto the experience of depression. So by saying that depression is a dark night of the soul, you're implying that this is in some way a good thing that's spiritually edifying, that somehow the will of God is behind it, because it's often framed as like a sort of gift from God once a person has reached that stage of spiritual maturity. And so it just assumes a lot of theological ideas that, may be resonant with some people's experiences of depression. I know our own kind of Keith Egan, a great Carmelite scholar who founded the Center for Spirituality, has some collections on Carmelite prayer where he has psychologists talking about how sometimes these things can be co-occurring, but that's often not the case. And I would say most often not the case. And so I've come to think about this common comparison as a way that religious people are often trying to grasp for the right language to talk about the experience, but don't actually have all of the kind of rich theological language that they need to do so.
I have a lot more questions, but let me ask just a few more, and then we'll open it up to the folks in the audience here and remotely. You acknowledged both in your remarks and in our conversation so far, and this is not a spoiler for folks who haven't yet read the book. And by the way, I neglected to mention in my introduction that the books are for sale by the St. Mary's campus bookstore out in the lobby. So please, for those who are present, feel free to buy, and Dr. Coblentz will be available to sign. But early in the book, you share some of your own experience as a depression sufferer. And I'm wondering, as I imagine a lot of readers probably wonder, how has it felt to have that part of your history and experience, which in some communities remains stigmatized, shared publicly? What has this experience been like for you?
It's been different than I expected. I feel like I have learned a lot from students about kind of shameless talk about mental health struggles. I feel like there's, a generation of students right now, kind of traditional undergraduates who have, I think, just a lot more courage than my generation and a lot of older generations about just naming these struggles and asking for help and seeking resources for mental health struggles. And it's been over the years their frankness that I think has helped me to be less ashamed and afraid to talk about these things. At the same time, I am a person who, while I've struggled quite a lot with depression throughout my life, am a person who has, at least to most people, seemed highly functional. I haven't always been highly functional, but I have worked very hard, I think, at times to maintain that appearance because I felt like I had to. And so the thing that's actually been hardest for me is sharing my experiences of depression with people who know me really well and knew me when I was really, really struggling. And they say, I didn't know. I feel bad. I didn't know. And that's not a part of me that they know. So that I'm still kind of processing that kind of surprise that's been what's hardest for me. But my hope has always been that by just being honest about these experiences, and sort of witnessing both to the real difficulty of depression, but also the ways that I survived and that my life, everything about my life right now was impossible to me then. And I want to bear witness to that for people who are going through depression right now, who will go through depression, in case it's any sort of encouragement that what seems impossible when you're depressed is not always impossible for many of us. So that made it seem worthwhile.
Last question from me, and then we'll open it up. You mentioned our traditional students today, most of whom would fall into this category, Generation Z, the Gen Zers. And it got me thinking about an experience I had 4 years ago in the before times, back before the pandemic, where things are much simpler then, right? And in 2018, the church was having a synod of bishops on young adults. And not unlike the synod on synodality that's happening now, where there's a lot of solicitation, or at least the hope is, and St. Mary's College is hosting such synodal experiences and conversations. Bishops from around the world were coming together in October of 2018 to talk about young adults. Again, that raises questions, right? They're very far from being young, or, well, I'll leave it at that. But I had the opportunity, I was in another part of the world. I won't mention the country, but I happened to be at a breakfast with a bishop who was appointed as one of the 300 representatives to the Synod of Bishops. And this bishop was sharing that he had hosted a number of listening sessions around the country, met with young adults, 18 to maybe 35 or so. And he said he was shocked to find out that the number one issue on young adults' minds before the pandemic, especially, it was mental health issues. Mm-hmm. And he said he was so compelled by the witness of these young adult Catholics that this was going to be, when he had 3 minutes at the floor of the synod to have his turn to speak, this was what he was going to talk about, and he did. I wish I had your book to give him at that time. So maybe if somebody has a time machine they're working on in the tri-campus area, we could test it out. But it elicits for me right now, especially in the pandemic and, God willing, moving out of the pandemic, where everybody has had a hard time, and those who suffer from depression or other forms of mental illness have had a harder time. I'm thinking of young adults in particular. What would you say to a synod, to the Pope, to church leaders, what would you say to the church in general? We are the church, all the baptized. What should the church do? What ought it do to address mental health concerns today? What's your wisdom for them?
I would need more than 3 minutes. I mean, on so many different levels, there's things we can do. I mean, I worship with the sisters at the Church of Loretto, and I noticed when prayers for those who are mentally ill are included in the petitions on Sunday, or when in a thoughtful way these issues are mentioned in a homily or something like that. There's very little things that churches could do immediately to signal like, we see you. but I think for real change to happen, the harder things have to be done as well. And simply put, I think like the harder things that will make the most difference are about putting love into action, right? I would love for churches to be communities that people who are struggling from depression can call upon to have somebody help them find a psychologist, to help them schedule a doctor's appointment, to come and sit with them and watch their kids because a postpartum depressed mother needs a break. These don't require mental health expertise. It doesn't require hiring a huge staff of mental health care providers. It is about kind of following through on the things that churches say they already want to be about. It's just not it requires something of people going out of their way, but those kind of material things and actions can be what helps people survive. I would also say that churches as communities are primed for collective action. And I talk about this in the book. I would love to see churches advocate for mental health care access. I would love to see churches participate in education campaigns around mental health stigma. These are societal problems that need kind of social solutions. And so one person's determination is not gonna solve it. The last thing I'll say is I think the church needs to reckon with how some of its teachings about queer people, about kind of racism, the inaction on racism, the realities of sexism, these realities are shown to contribute to and compound the mental health struggles of marginalized people. I think especially the church's teachings on homosexuality. I mean, I told you some of these statistics. It's astounding how much more disproportionately queer folks experience mental health conditions. And I think that is in some ways connected to stigma, to homophobia, to transphobia. And the church, if the church cares about mental illness, then it has to deal with that. There has to be a reckoning with how this is affecting people's lives in really consequential ways. I know that's a big task, but I think it's a life and death reality that the church has to deal with.
Thank you so much. We can begin with questions from those present here. And we also, I think, have some online. I see Dr. Molly Gower has a microphone ready at hand if folks have a comment or a question.
Maybe excuse me.
Sorry, I'm so far away.
No, my pleasure.
Hi, Jessica. Hi, Dan. I'm Ken. Jessica, I was intrigued by your description of depression, not simply as a kind of prolonged sadness, but also as a dislocation or as inhabiting or being a part of a different world. I guess when I hear that sort of second part, I think of the more like austere terms of like depersonalization and derealization. But given that that might be so unfamiliar to us, this idea, would you say sort of a little bit more about that kind of second part that you wanted us to sort of understand about the experience of depression?
Yeah, so in my study of depression, I kind of followed this imagery that I found in depression narratives themselves, this imagery of displacement, it's another world, it's another landscape, and tried to make sense of that in conversation with kind of existing scholarship on depression. And where that led me was to a lot of philosophical scholarship about depression, including a lot of folks working in phenomenology and psychiatry. And so I mentioned, at one point, this idea of unhomelikeness, excuse me. And that's coming directly from this phenomenological literature that's saying that when people experience depression, it's not just that they don't want to get out of bed. It's that actually the sort of possibilities for their day-to-day life have shifted so radically. The sort of backdrop of our experience that we're often unconscious of has shifted so radically that the very possibility of getting out of bed is no longer available to them. And among many of these kind of shifts that occur in the backdrop of people's experiences are things that concern kind of intersubjective interaction. So I'm really influenced by a philosopher named Matthew Radcliffe, who talks a lot about how depression affects people's perceptions of connection and belonging. And he argues that this kind of intersubjective shift is really central to how a lot of people experience depression. They feel like one common metaphor that people use and that he kind of also talks about is that, people are in the same room with somebody else, but they're living behind a glass wall. So they can see the other person. Everything seems normal on a superficial level, but their experience is that there's something that's sort of separating them. They can't connect with the other person in the way that they used to. And this contributes to the isolation and the struggle to kind of like explain experience to people. Feel like they don't have sort of common reference with other people to explain what they're going through. And so, that to me, it both resonated with the memoirs that I was reading, that language, but also kind of helped me make sense within a larger philosophical framework of what these people are going through. Yeah, thank you.
We welcome other questions or comments. Oh, down here, Sister Judy.
Sister Judy.
We just want to make sure our folks online can hear you too. I can repeat it if, okay, we got a mic. Great.
I'm just very proud to know both of you are here at St. Mary's because our church is so conflictive about all of this. And for many of our women, that's where they've gotten their image of God. And so that if they are struggling, either with their own identity or with some depression, that sense of connection and belonging is something that church should just be made for that. And I think the atmosphere that at least we try to provide here and on tri-campuses is to give people that sense. And so that hopefully it will override some of their experience of their local church or even the publicity. There's terrible publicity out there, and they must be very confused that one diocese opens their arms, another diocese won't even baptize you. I mean, that must be confusing. So I think when you said, what would you like to say to the church or to the bishops? I thought, well, I bet you've got a long notebook full of messages and training to the leaders in the church is so crucial, and not just the priests, but anybody ministering in the church. But I guess I am assured that our mental health staff, and we have counseling centers and I know that there are lots of opportunities. And if you could speak like, do you interact with those people, or are they, do you feel that they're providing that kind of support? Because again, our faith tells us that there's no way for God not to be present, and yet if some of them are still in that sense that this is a punishment, this is sin, I don't know how we ever got to that, but I just am confident that our environment is helping them to see that no matter how dark it is or how bad, they're not alone. If you could just speak a little bit about the environment.
Yeah, I mean, as a faculty member, I, with other faculty and staff, get updates about the resources that are available on campus to serve our students in terms of, traditional mental health counseling and things like that. I know there's been a wider effort to familiarize students with alternative forms of support, like pastoral counseling or kind of support groups on campus. I think of like Bells Supporting Bells and BAVO and campus ministry small groups, things like that, that while they're not the same and not a replacement for mental health counseling and things like that, they do provide for a lot of students that extra community and sense of belonging, that extra sense of support that can be really, really valuable. And I should just say too, one of the things that I kind of talk about in the book is, if we think about depression as a sort of displacement into another world, if somebody is already going through that, they're already going through this sort of unwilled radical change that's so difficult in their lives that they're trying to endure, how much worse if they have a faith community that is going to sort of abandon them by shaming them for their condition or just not even have anything to say about it at all. I think part of why I feel so passionate about kind of expanding Christian theological resources on depression is so that people who are going through this really isolating and difficult experience can, at the very least, have some resources on offer from their faith communities. How much worse if they don't even have that amid this difficult experience? So I hope that the church will continue to do that. And I know people are working in earnest at St. Mary's to do that, but there's so much need that it can't just be the counseling office, right? It has to be a broader campus effort. And I'm encouraged to see that recognized and some effort to be made in that regard.
So I see two hands in the auditorium over here first, and then we've got you over here on next.
Thank you. I mostly raised my hand because Molly was on the other side of the room. Based on Dan's first question to you, Jess, and your response, it struck me that as a people, we have moved pretty far away from we into the I. And I'm not talking about words of baptism. And a depressed person is desperate to know they belong. It strikes me that that's where God is present initially to that person, calling them to community. So the community has to be there. It has to be, move away from the I into the we and realize that your depression, among other things, is a deep yearning for belonging, which is only satisfied in communion. So that's just a thought I had, and I'd be interested in your reactions to that, maybe both of you.
Yeah, I do think that studying depression has convinced me of the importance of community on a whole other way. I think there is a sort of radical yearning for belonging, like what you're naming. so eloquently. I will say, like, I think we're at a really interesting point in time to think about the individual and the community, right? Because all of us have endured this really strange experience of social isolation. And I know from so many people, both those struggling with mental health conditions and people who are who seem to fare pretty well in social isolation, everybody is saying, like, wow, I really appreciate in a new way the importance of community, of belonging, of socializing in healthy ways and things like that. For a time, that was giving me hope that maybe we would emerge from social isolation and be a more community-oriented people, like what I think you're calling for in your observations. I don't know if that's going to happen, though. But I would hate for us to miss the opportunity to talk about that, about the importance of community and belonging in the wake of this large-scale collective experience of isolation. If we can talk about that on a broader scale, I think it will only help those of us who are really struggling with isolation, of depression and other mental illness. But we have a lot of work to do, because I think you're right. We have moved increasingly, it seems, to more and more individualized kind of lifestyles.
We have one more question here.
Hear me? Yeah. Okay. First, I just want to say how much I appreciate, like, you writing this book and having this presentation and speaking about this, because I grew up in a very, like, traditional Christian household where gender roles were heavily enforced, and, like, some of these stereotypical, like, societal rules were heavily enforced and like put on to me and my sisters. And so it was always socially taboo to talk about, like, mental health, sexuality, gender, and all these different things. And so, but coming here and being exposed to it and like realizing how much of an open conversation it can and should be was just absolutely amazing, and made me feel more like at home and so much more comfortable being present in a society. So first, I just want to say thank you. And then also, I kind of had a follow-up question is, I do find, like, the broad aspect of having a sense of community completely necessary. But for some people like me, it's kind of terrifying to go to this, what seems like massive massive group of people who, like, this was their whole life. And then, like, people like me or other people who might not have been exposed to this from a young age, it's so daunting almost. So what can I or other students or other youths do in order to make, like, this smaller sense of community, to make it seem less daunting?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, for your comment and your question. Well, I think that when we talk about community, at its core, we're talking about relationships, right? It's networks of people. And I think sometimes we might get the impression that in order to have a strong community, we have to have a huge network of friends and know lots of people and all these things. But I don't know. I want to say, like, the older I get, the more I realize that it's quality over quantity, right? That having a few good people who know me and who I can know, and that we can kind of love each other in even difficult ways, that can be enough for community and this sense of belonging in the world. I think, people have different personalities, and some people need that larger kind of network of people. But for some of us, and it sounds like maybe you're more like me in this regard, like, having a sense of belonging can be a matter of a few people. I also think that I know this isn't everybody's experience, but for me, one of the things that I really like about being Catholic, and I'm sure this is true of other people's experiences of other faiths, is sometimes I show up to a prayer service and I don't even talk to anybody else, but I feel like I'm a part of something bigger. I'm sitting next to other people who came here because they felt a similar kind of yearning to be here. And sometimes there's a contentment that I've experienced in that too. That's not about, being best friends with everybody around me, but a recognition that there's a sort of shared humanity and experience among other people that I think can be a real comfort too. In fact, I found when I was really struggling with depression that I didn't really want to socialize with a lot of people. That was really hard. But I found some comfort in being a part of other communities where I could just show up and have a shared experience. Religion is one way that people do that, I think sometimes. There are other ways, but I'd be happy to talk more about that with you.
We're about at time. And so before we offer a final thanks, I hope this experience, this presentation and conversation has encouraged those of us physically present to be interested in reading the book itself. And if so, a reminder that they're for sale in the lobby. But also the Religious Studies and Theology Department and Gender and Women's Studies are co-sponsoring a reception in honor of Dr. Coblentz's book launch. All who are physically present, sorry, virtual folks and friends, you can join us in spirit, are welcome to join us for the reception in room 254B, just, I believe, to the right as you exit the auditorium after you buy your books. And finally, before we extend our thanks to you, just one announcement. Our next Ex Libris author lecture series is going to take place on Thursday, March 3rd, same bat time, same bat location here in Carroll Auditorium. And we'll be welcoming Dr. Anna Corwin, a anthropologist at the other St. Mary's, this of St. Mary's of California, who will be here to speak on her book, Embracing Age, How Catholic Nuns Became Models of Aging Well. So you don't have to be a Sister of the Holy Cross to come, but you certainly are a VIP if you're with us. Please join me in thanking Dr. Coblentz for her work and her sharing.